On Tuesday morning, I opened a letter that declared me dead. The envelope looked ordinary, stamped with a familiar seal. But the words inside erased me with a single line: claim for life insurance policy. Deceased, Harold Harris. If a letter can bury a living man, what else can be stolen from him in the world of the living? My name, my policy. Deceased. I read it twice, 3 times. According to this letter, I was already dead. And worse, someone had filed the claim. Someone had written me out of existence. Neighbors had always joked that retirement was like disappearing, but this wasn't a joke. This was a theft of life itself. If I was dead on paper, what else could they take from me in the world of the living? What would you do if you opened a letter and found your own death declared inside? Would you stay silent or fight to prove you were alive? Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe, because this story is only just beginning. If this happened to you, would you stay quiet or fight back? Tell me in the comments and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Every morning began the same way. Coffee percolating on the old machine, the smell of toasted bread, and the creak of the porch swing as I settled into it. I liked to sit there with the sun coming up over the maples, a stack of bills on one side and the morning paper on the other. From my porch, I watched the world wake up, the mail truck rumbling down the street, kids with backpacks racing to the bus stop, neighbors waving as they walked their dogs. On Sundays, the church down the block rang its bell at noon, and on Wednesdays, the senior center van idled at the corner, picking up folks for bingo. The local news played low on my kitchen TV, while I clipped coupons for Walmart. It wasn't much, but it was a life, and it was mine. It was a modest neighborhood, the kind of place where lawns weren't perfect, but people still borrowed sugar from each other. I had lived here for over 40 years. My house wasn't big, but it was mine, paid for, with decades of clocking in at the factory, hands blistered, back bent. I had once thought I would die on that assembly line, but life had other plans. The factory shut down, and I retired earlier than expected. Still, the insurance policy I bought years ago was the one thing I knew I could leave behind. After my wife Anna passed away, the house grew quieter than I could bear. We had raised one son, David, who married Melissa. They visited sometimes. Not as often as I wished, but often enough that I kept the porch swing painted and the coffee fresh. Melissa always smiled too wide, asked too many questions. Have you thought about moving into a home? It would be easier for everyone, she'd say, brushing imaginary dust from the counter. David said little, just nodded as though silence could keep the peace. I kept my papers in a locked cabinet. The deed to the house, old tax returns, Anna's medical records, and one manila folder with a red sticker, life policy. It wasn't a secret, but it wasn't a conversation I wanted to have at every Sunday dinner either. My wife and I had agreed years ago the beneficiary would be changed to our grandson when he turned 18. Until then, the policy would remain under my name with instructions sealed in my will. One evening, I walked in to find Melissa rifling through a drawer in my study. She looked up quickly, holding a stack of old envelopes. "Just tidying," she said, her voice too light. I didn't argue, but I noticed the way her eyes lingered on the locked cabinet where my important papers were kept. A week later, Mrs. Parker from next door stopped me at the mailbox. She leaned in close, whispering. I overheard Melissa on the phone. She said, "The insurance money will be ours soon." Her words sat heavy in my chest. I smiled, thanked her, and walked back inside. But that night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling fan, turning slow circles, wondering what Melissa was planning and whether David would ever stop her. I tried to busy myself with the ordinary routines of life, hoping they would anchor me. Each morning, I walked to the end of the street to fetch the newspaper. I greeted the neighbors, sometimes lingering for small talk about the weather or the price of groceries. In the evenings, I sat on the porch with the radio humming old country songs, letting the voices fill the spaces where my wife's laughter used to be. My grandson visited when he could, his backpack slung over his shoulder, his eyes bright with questions. We would sit at the kitchen table building puzzles or share ice cream straight from the carton. In those moments, the house felt alive again. I often thought all of this, every hour in that factory, every scar on my hands was for him, for his future. One night, as I tucked him into the spare bed during a sleepover, he asked, "Grandpa, will you always be here?" I swallowed the lump in my throat. "As long as I can, kiddo. And even after, I'll make sure you're taken care of." It was the kind of promise children believe without question, the kind that adults carry like a burden. But as Melissa's eyes grew sharper with each visit and David's silence grew heavier, I wondered if I could keep that promise. A storm was brewing quietly inside my own family, and I feared it would break sooner than I was ready for. The clang of metal and the hiss of steam were sounds I once lived by. For decades, the factory was my world. I rose before dawn, clocked in while the sky was still dark, and returned home long after the sun had disappeared. Overtime was not a choice, it was survival. Every hour meant a little more in savings, a little more security for the family I was determined to protect. There was one night I will never forget. A machine malfunctioned, sparks erupting in a cascade of fire. I slipped my hand, caught for an instant, and in that instant my life nearly ended. The foreman pulled me free, his face pale, the smell of burned cloth thick in the air. The doctor later told me I was lucky, that another second would have cost me more than scars. That was when I realized how fragile life truly was. It wasn't enough to work and save. I needed to prepare for the day when I might not come home. So I bought the policy, a life insurance contract. I remember the weight of the pen in my hand as I signed. My wife, Anna, sat beside me at the kitchen table, her fingers resting lightly on my arm. "This is not for us," she said softly. "This is for our grandson. One day he will need help and we won't be here. Promise me it will go to him." I nodded. I promise. That promise shaped the rest of my life. No matter the overtime, no matter the broken bones, I reminded myself this is for him, for the boy who carried our hopes. Years passed. My grandson grew, his laughter filling the house on weekends. I remember holding the back of his bicycle as he wobbled down the driveway, my knees aching, but my heart light as he finally pedaled on his own. Rainy mornings when I drove him to school, the wipers fighting against the storm, his small voice in the back seat reading from a book. Nights when fever gripped him and I sat by his bed, a cool cloth on his forehead, whispering stories until his eyes closed. These were the moments that mattered. Anna, my wife, grew ill in her later years. I became her caretaker, cooking meals she barely touched, helping her dress, holding her hand during the long nights when pain would not let her sleep. One evening, as the sun faded through the curtains, she turned to me with eyes clouded but fierce. "Don't let them take it," she whispered. Her hand squeezed mine weakly. "That money is for him. Don't let anyone else touch it." I swallowed hard. "I won't. I swear it." She smiled faintly, then drifted into sleep. A week later, she was gone. The house became too quiet, too large, but her words echoed in every corner. I carried them like scripture. Don't let them take it. It was after her death that Melissa, my daughter-in-law, began circling like a hawk. She had always been polite enough before, but something shifted. Her questions turned sharper. One afternoon, as she cleared dishes from the table, she asked casually, "If something were to happen to you, who would receive the insurance payout?" I nearly dropped my fork. "That's not a subject I care to discuss," I answered flatly. She tilted her head, smiling. "Oh, I was just curious. These things can be complicated. Families fight over them all the time." "My wife and I already decided," I said firmly. "It's not open for debate." Her smile thinned, but she said nothing more. Still, the seed had been planted, and I felt its roots digging into the cracks of trust. A few weeks later, my neighbor, Mr. Harris, caught me on the sidewalk. He was trimming his hedges, sweat glistening on his brow. "I probably shouldn't say anything," he muttered, lowering his voice. "But I overheard your daughter-in-law on the phone. She mentioned insurance money, said it would be theirs soon." My mouth went dry. "Are you sure?" He nodded. "I don't like to meddle, but I know what I heard." I forced a laugh, tried to wave it off. "Maybe you misheard." But in my gut, I knew he hadn't. Harris was not the sort to invent stories. His words gnawed at me that night as I lay awake staring at the ceiling. The next time Melissa came by, I tested her. "You've been asking about nursing homes a lot lately," I said, keeping my tone casual. "Why so interested?" Her eyes flickered. "I just think it would be best. Easier for you, safer, and easier for you," I asked, watching her closely. She laughed too quickly. "Don't be silly. I only care about your well-being." But the chill in her smile told me otherwise. David, my son, was no help. He avoided confrontation, hiding behind silence. When I pressed him, he muttered, "Melissa just wants what's best. Maybe it's time you considered it." I looked at him hard. "And what do you want, David? Do you want me gone too?" He flushed, unable to meet my eyes. I don't want conflict. Conflict. That was his word for it. But what I saw was weakness. My wife had been right. He was too weak to stand against her. Alone in the house, I thought of Anna, her warning, her plea. I opened the locked drawer one more time, staring at the policy, running my fingers over the paper. The ink had not faded, the promise still binding, yet for the first time I feared it was no longer safe. Not because of strangers, but because of those closest to me. I sat at the desk, pen in hand, and wrote in my journal, "If they come for this, they will have to bury me first." Little did I know that is exactly what they would attempt on paper, if not in flesh. After nights like those when sleep would not come, I often wandered through the house with my grandson's photographs in my hand. In one, he was dressed in a baseball uniform, grinning with 2 front teeth missing. In another, he held a science fair ribbon, his eyes wide with pride. I remembered sitting in the bleachers during his games, clapping until my palms stung, shouting his name as if my voice alone could push him across home plate. Those were the treasures I carried, not medals from the factory or plaques from the company. There were evenings when Anna and I would sit on the porch watching him chase fireflies. She would laugh, her eyes sparkling. "He's our second chance," she'd whisper. And she was right. Every sacrifice I made at the factory felt small when measured against his joy. I thought back, too, to the nights when Anna's illness deepened. Our grandson would bring her flowers from the yard, placing them gently in a jar by her bedside. "Don't be sad, Grandma," he would say. "I'll help take care of you." Anna would weep silently, her hand clutching mine. Both of us marveling at the kindness of a boy so young. Melissa never shared in those moments. She stayed on the edges, polite but distant. Yet after Anna's funeral, her presence grew heavier. She asked questions with a sweetness that felt false, like sugarcoating something bitter. "Wouldn't you want to ensure everything is in order?" she asked once, lingering over my shoulder as I wrote bills at the table. "These documents, they can get confusing." "I could help. I can manage," I told her. My tone left no room for debate. Her smile flickered, but she pressed on. "Still, it's best to prepare. No one lives forever." Those words clung to me long after she left. They were not the gentle musings of a caring daughter-in-law. They were the calculations of someone watching the clock. Even David, my son, seemed to bend beneath her will. When I mentioned my discomfort, he shrugged helplessly. "Melissa's just being practical. You can't expect her not to think about the future." The future, I said bitterly, should not be planned on the grave of the living. He had no reply. He simply looked away, and I felt the distance between us grow wider. I began to write more in my journal. Memories of Anna, of our grandson, of the factory of promises made and kept. But the entries darkened over time. Doubt bled into the pages. Fear crept in between the lines. I started to wonder if the life I had built, the sacrifices I had made, would all be stolen, not by strangers, but by those seated at my own table. On one particularly restless night, I wrote a line that chilled even me. "They are waiting for me to die, and if I don't, they might try to help the world believe I already have." The letter weighed heavily in my pocket as I walked the length of Main Street toward the downtown insurance office. The building seemed taller than usual, shadows stretching across the sidewalk. I felt like a ghost among the living, each step echoing a thought I couldn't shake on paper. I no longer existed. The receptionist greeted me politely, though her expression faltered when I handed over the envelope. She scanned the paperwork, her brow knitting tighter with every page she turned. Finally, she excused herself and disappeared into a back office. Minutes later, a claims officer approached a man in a gray suit with tired eyes. He extended his hand. "Mr. Harris, I'm Mr. Collins. Please step into my office." I followed him down a hall lined with certificates and motivational posters, each proclaiming honesty and integrity. The words felt hollow. We sat across from each other at his desk. He adjusted his glasses, scanned the documents once more, then looked at me gravely. "Mr. Harris, I need to clarify something. We received a death claim under your name." I forced a bitter laugh. "As you can see, I'm not dead." He nodded slowly, clearly unsettled. "Yes, that much is obvious. However, the paperwork submitted to us is convincing. The beneficiary listed is Melissa Harris, your daughter-in-law. The claim amount is substantial." My throat tightened. "Show me." He turned the file toward me. There it was in black and white, a certified copy of a death certificate bearing my name, date of birth, and a false date of death. The signature of a county registrar stamped at the bottom, the official seal pressed into the paper. My hands trembled as I traced the lines. This is a lie. This is murder without a body, I said. You tried to bury me in ink. Collins nodded grimly. We noticed inconsistencies. The file number format is outdated, and the notary's name doesn't match our records. Because of that, the claim has been suspended pending further verification. But Mr. Harris, someone went to considerable effort to create this. Anger rose in me, but so did despair. To be erased like this, reduced to a line on a forged document, it was more than betrayal. It was annihilation. My daughter-in-law did this, I muttered. She wants the payout. She wants me gone. Collins leaned forward, lowering his voice. Between us, we've seen fraud before. But usually it's strangers, not family. He shook his head. The seal from the Vital Records office worries me. It suggests someone inside is complicit. I gripped the edge of the desk until my knuckles whitened. My son's face flashed in my mind. David. Silent. Always silent. Did he know? Did he stand by while she buried me on paper? Later that evening, I confronted them. Melissa and David sat in their living room, the television droning in the background. I laid the copy of the forged death certificate on the coffee table. Melissa's face drained of color, but she recovered quickly, plastering on a smile. This is absurd, she said, her voice high and brittle. Anyone could have made this. Anyone, I snapped. The beneficiary is you. Who else would stand to gain? David shifted uncomfortably, staring at his hands. Dad, maybe we should talk about this calmly. Calmly, I barked. You let her do this, you knew. He said nothing. His silence was an answer louder than words. My heart broke in that moment more deeply than it had when I buried my wife. At least she had left me with love. My son left me with betrayal. Melissa tried to regain control. You're being dramatic. It's probably a mistake with forged seals, with my name erased. I leaned forward, my voice trembling with rage. This is not a mistake. This is murder without a body. She scoffed, but her eyes flickered with fear. No one will believe you. That night, I began to plan. I photographed every page of the forged documents, stored them in a folder marked, "For my lawyer." I called Mrs. Parker, my neighbor, and asked if she would testify to what she had overheard. She agreed, her voice firm with indignation. I won't let them get away with this, she said. The next day, I returned to the insurance office with a small recorder in my pocket. I asked Collins to explain again slowly what had been filed. His words captured on tape were damning. The claim listed you as deceased. The death certificate submitted carries official seals. The payout was requested to Melissa Harris. When I replayed the recording that night, I felt both vindicated and sickened. Proof existed, but proof alone might not save me if corruption reached into the county offices. The weeks that followed were a blur of quiet investigation. I traced the notary's name non-existent. I compared the format of the certificate to legitimate samples. Subtle errors revealed themselves. Each clue painted a picture of deliberate, calculated fraud. I pressed David again. We sat on the porch one evening, silence stretching between us. Finally, I asked, "Did you know about the claim?" He flinched. His lips parted, but no words came. He stared out at the street as if salvation lay in the distance. "I didn't stop her," he whispered at last. The confession cut deeper than any blade. "By staying silent, you became her accomplice," I said quietly. He hung his head, shame radiating off him, but not enough to undo the damage. Melissa avoided me after that, but I caught her one afternoon sorting papers in the kitchen. I asked casually, "Is this about the nursing home again? You seem awfully concerned with my future." She froze, the color draining from her face. "I don't know what you mean." "Oh, I think you do," I replied evenly. "You've been rehearsing my death for some time." Her hands shook as she shoved the papers back into a folder. "You're imagining things," she snapped, storming out. But her panic confirmed what I already knew: the fraud was hers. The silence was David's, and the burden of proof was mine. I consulted a lawyer, Mr. Bradley, a man with a sharp mind and a sharper tongue. He examined the documents, whistling low. "This isn't amateur work," he said, "but it's sloppy enough to trace. We'll build a case." His confidence steadied me. For the first time since opening that cursed envelope, I felt less like a ghost and more like a man fighting to reclaim his name. Still at night, doubt gnawed at me. What if the system failed? What if money and influence buried the truth as easily as Melissa had buried me on paper? I lay awake, Anna's voice echoing, "Don't let them take it." I wrote again in my journal, the ink blurring under my tears. They will not steal his future. Not while I draw breath. Days later, Collins from the insurance office called me. "Mr. Harris, the claim has been escalated to our fraud division. They will investigate further, but be cautious. Whoever filed this had access to official seals. That means this isn't just a family dispute, it's a crime that may reach deeper than you realize." His warning chilled me. What started as betrayal within my home now bled into institutions meant to protect me. Yet I was not powerless. I had witnesses, recordings, documents, and above all, the truth of my existence. I stood at the mirror one morning studying the lines on my face, the scars on my hands. They tried to erase me, but every wrinkle, every mark was proof of life. I was not dead, and I would not let them write me off so easily. The battle lines were drawn. I was no longer just a father or grandfather. I was a man, fighting against erasure itself, preparing to bring my own family to account in a court of law. If you discovered your own death certificate stamped and sealed, would you forgive the ones who filed it or drag them into the light of justice? Share your thoughts below, and remember to like and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. In the days that followed, the weight of what had been attempted pressed down on me like a storm cloud refusing to break. I found myself checking the locks twice before bed, leaving lights on in rooms I wasn't in, and pausing at every creak of the floorboards. Betrayal had a way of changing the air inside a house. It made every shadow seem dangerous, every silence suspicious. I decided to confront Melissa again, but this time with a calmer tone. I found her in the kitchen scrolling on her phone while a pot boiled on the stove. "Melissa," I said evenly, "why don't you tell me the truth? Do you really think you deserve the insurance money?" She stiffened her thumb, frozen above the screen. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Stop pretending I pressed. The documents bear your name. You filed a claim for money meant for my grandson." "Do you feel no shame?" Her jaw clenched. "You've had your time, Harold. You've had your life. Don't you think it's time to pass things on?" "Pass things on," I repeated bitterly. "That's not passing, it's stealing." Before she could respond, David entered. He glanced between us, unease written across his face. "What's going on?" "Ask your wife," I told him coldly. "She thinks I should be dead already." Melissa turned on him desperate. "He's twisting everything, David. He doesn't understand how hard it's been for us. The bills, the mortgage, the college fund for our son." "Our son?" I cut in sharply. "You mean my grandson? The very boy this policy was meant to protect. Don't drag him into your greed." David rubbed his temples, overwhelmed. "Please stop. I can't handle this." His weakness enraged me. "You can't handle the truth, you mean? You would rather drown in silence than stand up to her lies." Melissa's eyes blazed. "You'll regret this, Harold. If you push too far, you'll end up alone in some facility and no one will care what you say." Her threat chilled me, but I met her glare without flinching. Better alone with the truth than surrounded by lies. The following week, my lawyer Bradley invited me to his office. Papers were stacked high on his desk, the blinds half closed to shield us from the midday sun. He spread out the forged certificate alongside legitimate samples. "See here," he explained, tapping the header. "The font style changed 2 years ago. Whoever created this used the old template." He pointed again. "And the registrar's signature. It belongs to a man who retired in 2015. Sloppy. We can expose this." I leaned closer, my heart pounding with a mixture of dread and hope. "But what about the seal?" "People will believe it if they see the county stamp." Bradley nodded. "That's the most troubling part. It suggests either someone gained unauthorized access to an official seal, or someone inside the office is cooperating. Either way, this isn't just family betrayal, it's institutional fraud, which means the authorities will have to take it seriously." His words steadied me. Yet they also raised the stakes. If Melissa was willing to falsify death, what else might she do to protect her scheme? I began to document everything. Each phone call to the insurance company, each overheard comment, Each unusual glance Melissa cast my way. I recorded it all in a notebook, evidence for the day this would reach a courtroom. Mrs. Parker. My neighbor grew even more vocal. She cornered me at the mailbox one afternoon. "I've told my sister about this," she confided. "She says you should go straight to the newspaper, expose them before they bury the truth." Her idea tempted me, but Bradley advised patience. "Let the system work first," he said. "We need to give the fraud division a chance to investigate. If they fail, then we go public." I trusted him, but waiting was agony. Every hour that passed felt like a gamble against time, a test of whether I could survive being erased. Then came the call that changed everything. Collins phoned me again, his voice tense. "Mr. Harris, we've discovered that the forged certificate was notarized with a stamp that went missing from the county office 6 months ago. This isn't just fraud, it's theft of government property. That elevates the case." I gripped the receiver tightly. "What does that mean for me?" It means Collins said that the authorities will be involved soon. But be careful. If your daughter-in-law has connections inside the records office, she may try to cover her tracks or silence anyone who stands in her way. The warning hit me like ice water. Silence anyone. Could Melissa, with her sharp smiles and sharper ambitions, go further than paperwork? I prayed it wasn't so. But trust was a luxury I no longer had. That night I wrote one final line in my journal. "They buried me once on paper. They will not bury me again in life." The kitchen was quiet enough to hear the refrigerator breathe. I opened my journal and wrote, "They buried me on paper, but I still breathe." Anna's chipped mug waited beside the sink like a witness. I touched the lip of it and whispered, "I will not let them take what we built." Grief didn't vanish. It picked a side. Tomorrow I would fight. Ichthus, turning point. Dawn broke in a wash of pewter light, the kind that made old bones announce themselves. I was up before the kettle hissed, before the sparrows found their nerve. On the table lay my neat stacks, copies of every record, photos of the forged certificate, a small recorder labeled in thick black ink, and the notebook that had become my second memory. Last night's silence had done its work. Grief cooled into purpose. I placed each stack into a large brown envelope, one for my lawyer, one for the insurer's fraud division, one for me. Then I put on my best jacket, the one with enough weight in the lining to remind a man of his posture. In the mirror, I saw the face of a foreman who'd worked double shifts through 3 recessions. They papered me over with a counterfeit death. Today, I would write my name back in ink they couldn't bleach. Bradley's office was a 2-flight climb and smelled like law school and coffee. He looked up, read my stride, and pushed aside the files on his desk. "You look different," he said, "because I'm done being a ghost." I set the envelope down. "This is everything." He sorted in silence, recorder photos, the insurer's letter, my journal excerpts. Mrs. Parker's brief statement scribbled on lined paper. He nodded at each like a metronome. "We go on offense," he said at last, "not just the insurer. We refer this to the district attorney. If a government seal was stolen or misused, this is criminal. And my son." I asked, the words sanded down by shame. "Silence isn't a charge," he said, gentle but firm. "But sunlight has a way of making people choose a side." We rode the elevator together, 2 old suits in a chrome box. On the street, winter light sharpened the sidewalks. Bradley stuffed the evidence into his leather case and hailed a cab. "Fraud division first," he said, "then the DA." At the insurer's headquarters, Collins met us in the lobby, relief written across his face. "Mr. Harris," he said, voice pitching upward, "thank God." He led us past frosted glass into a conference room with a long table and a humming scanner. 2 investigators were already there, one middle-aged with a legal pad, the other younger, tapping a laptop. They stopped when they saw me, their eyes widening almost involuntarily. "That's him," the younger one whispered. "The deceased." I took my seat and placed both hands on the table, palms down like a vow. Bradley handled the talking, crisp and economical, while I provided the anchor of a living witness. The recorder clicked, the scanner whirred, the legal pad filled with small, furious handwriting. Collins pushed a printout across to us. "This seal," he said, tapping the raised impression on the forged death certificate, "was authenticated by a registrar who retired years ago. The registry number corresponds to a batch reported missing 6 months back. We flagged it, but needed confirmation. Your presence is decisive." He offered a rueful half-smile. "It's not every day a dead man signs in at reception. Enjoy the novelty," I said. "Then bury the fraud." The older investigator looked at me over his glasses. "Mr. Harris, if you're willing, we'll be requesting a statement for the district attorney this afternoon. There appears to be a government insider, or at least an accomplice with access to stolen materials." There it was proof that the rot ran beyond my front door. Relief came mixed with a darker flavor, the kind a man tastes when he learns his wound wasn't an accident. "I'll give my statement," I said, "and I'll testify." We finished near noon. Bradley shook hands with the investigators, exchanged cards, and we stepped back out into a city that had brightened as if it approved. On the sidewalk, a school group shuffled past in bright hats, a ribbon of noise and possibility. I thought of my grandson and steadied myself. "DA's office," Bradley asked. "Let's finish what we started," I said. At the DA's office, the referral turned into warrants. By evening, boxes and a seal press came out of my son's house. The stolen seal meant this wasn't just family trouble, it was a crime. Investigators traced emails to a records clerk. The seal wasn't faked, it was stolen. My erasure had accomplices. I had wanted vindication. I wasn't sure I was ready for handcuffs on my son's wife. But justice entered rooms without asking how you felt about the furniture. By late afternoon, the search teams moved. I didn't go. I'm not built for watching a house turn inside out, but word traveled faster than breath in neighborhoods like ours. Mrs. Parker called, first voice sharp with the thrill of truth coming home. "3 cars, Harold. They're carrying out boxes." David looked like he'd swallowed a stone. Bradley confirmed an hour later by text recovered emails. Payment trail, contact with a records clerk named H. Diaz, seizure of an embossing device. I read the message twice, then set the phone face down. Somewhere in me, a string pulled tight for weeks finally slackened. At dusk, I walked the block. Neighbors watched as detectives closed the trunk of an unmarked sedan. One gave me a small nod, a silent recognition. Back home, I set water to boil and made tea the way Anna used to when the night was planning hard weather. I sat at the table and wrote in my notebook, "They cracked the seal that tried to bury me. The state sees me. I am not erased." I left the journal open like a window. The call from Morales came just after 9. "We have enough," she said. "We're charging Melissa Harris with insurance fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. We're also detaining a clerk at the records office in connection with the stolen seal." "Mr. Harris, I need to ask again. Are you still willing to testify?" My voice didn't shake. "And I'll look her in the eye. Then we'll schedule a preliminary hearing. Get some sleep if you can." Sleep was a relative term. I lay down, but memory kept me upright. The first day David brought Melissa over, her laugh had ricocheted in my kitchen like sunlight. I remembered thinking she was ambitious. I did not imagine she would aim to inherit a living man. Somewhere in the stack of yesterdays, innocence had expired without paperwork. Morning arrived austere and clean. I put on the same jacket, let it become my uniform. Before leaving, I picked up my grandson's drawing from the fridge, a stick figure version of me holding his small square hand. Both of us smiling with more teeth than seemed practical. I folded the paper and slipped it into my breast pocket, close to the old engine that kept insisting on work. The courthouse smelled like old wood and the second page of a book. Reporters idled near the entrance, not a swarm, just enough cameras to turn truth into text later. Bradley met me at the steps. "Steady as the play," he said. "Answer only what's asked. Speak like you're building a fence post by post." We passed through security and down a corridor where everything echoed a hallway for measuring conscience. Inside the small courtroom, the benches were sparsely filled. Melissa sat at the defense table, hair pulled back, a jacket too sharp for the hour. She didn't look at me at first. When she finally did, it was a look that tried 3 expressions: charm, disdain, innocence, and landed on none. David sat behind the rail, not beside her. He stared at the floor as if the grain in the wood might spell a different story. The judge entered. The room rose. Formalities are a kind of mercy. They allow ordinary breath to keep pace with extraordinary facts. The prosecutor called the case. Morales rose, posture like a line drawn with a ruler. "People call Harold Harris," she said. I stood. Bradley squeezed my elbow, once a pressure, not a rescue. I made my way to the witness stand and took the oath with a right hand that had seen presses and pulleys and pay envelopes and once the soft crown of a newborn head. "State your name for the record," Morales said. "Harold Harris." I let my voice find its footing. And contrary to that certificate, I am alive. A whisper ran across the benches, the courtroom equivalent of a gust. Melissa's mouth tightened, then trembled, whether with anger or fear I could not tell. I kept my eyes forward. I was a man giving weather, not opinion. Morales paced her questions with care. "Mr. Harris, did you receive notice of a life insurance claim made in your name?" "Yes." "Was the claim accompanied by a death certificate purporting to certify your death?" "Yes." "Were you at that time dead?" I almost smiled. "No." A few chuckles loosened the air. Even judges let oxygen in sometimes. Morales brought me to the documents to my visit with Collins, to the recorder, to the seal described as stolen. Each answer was a plank. Together they made something that could bear weight. When she asked whether I recognized the name of the beneficiary listed on the claim, I said yes. Melissa Harris, my daughter-in-law. "Do you see her in the courtroom today?" I turned my head. "Yes." I pointed without malice. "There." Melissa looked at me, then really looked, and for a second I saw the architecture of her belief that money was a better inheritance than love, that shortcuts were a kind of intelligence, that old men were paperwork waiting to happen. The image broke, and she looked away. Morales finished, and the defense rose. Melissa's attorney had a voice like a soothing radio. "Mr. Harris, isn't it true that you've been in declining health, that you sometimes confuse dates, misplace items?" "I lose my keys like anyone else," I said. "But I don't misplace my life." A few smiles. The judge didn't bother to gavel them down. The attorney tried a new tack. "Isn't it possible this was a clerical error, that someone else submitted a certificate in good faith? In good faith with a stolen seal, and my daughter-in-law as beneficiary. That's a lot of faith for a funeral I never had." By the time cross ended, the benches were quiet in a way that wasn't boredom. It was a listening quiet, the kind that puts its hands in its lap. The judge called a recess. I stepped down, and as I passed the rail, David stood up as if pulled by a string. His eyes were red-rimmed, not from tears, but from a man's refusal to admit he'd cried. "Dad," he whispered. He didn't finish. "Son," I said, and the word tasted like years. "The truth is a door. Pick a side of it." He nodded once, small as a breath. The courthouse steps were still damp from the morning rain, and the air smelled faintly of iron and paper. As Melissa was led out in handcuffs, cameras clicked like a swarm of insects. She kept her chin lifted, but her eyes betrayed a tremor that no lawyer's coaching could fix. David followed a few paces behind, not cuffed but diminished his shoulders, bent his gaze fixed on the stone beneath his shoes. Neighbors who had come to watch whispered in low voices. For them, this was a spectacle. For me, it was the grave of trust. I stepped out into the light not as the man erased on paper, but as the one who had clawed his way back into existence. The flashbulbs caught the lines on my face, the furrows carved by factory shifts and sleepless nights. Reporters shouted questions, but I heard only the sound of my grandson's laughter, echoing in memory, reminding me why I had fought so hard to stay in the land of the living. I gave no statements. The truth had been spoken where it mattered, in the courtroom. Outside, I carried only silence and the weight of what family can destroy. Later that afternoon, Bradley called me into his office. He handed me a thin envelope aged at the edges. "This was among the files Mrs. Harris deposited years ago," he said gently. "It was sealed until the policy was contested. I thought you should be the one to open it." My hands trembled as I broke the seal. Inside was a letter penned in Anna's looping script. The sight of her handwriting undid me more than any verdict could. I read aloud, voice breaking. "If you are holding this, Harold, it means our fears were not unfounded. We always knew Melissa's hunger might grow too sharp. This policy, this house, our life's work, it belongs to our grandson. Promise me again, don't let them take it. Love does not end when one of us leaves. It endures and it demands courage." Reading her words, I felt she was with me again, steadying my shaking spine. She had trusted me to finish what we began, and through this letter she stood witness beside me. I folded the paper carefully, placed it back into the envelope, and held it to my chest. "We kept the promise, Anna," I whispered. "We kept it." When I walked home that evening, my grandson ran to meet me, backpack bouncing. I lifted him into my arms. For the first time in months, the house behind me felt like shelter again. Inside, I set Anna's photograph on the kitchen table next to the folded letter. I poured 2 cups of tea, one for me and one for the memory of her. The steam rose like a benediction. "We did it," I said to her smiling face. "He's safe. Our love outlived their betrayal." As dusk settled, I sat on the porch swing with my grandson beside me. He leaned against my arm, and for once I didn't feel the weight of ghosts, only the quiet strength of survival. Family can betray, yes, but truth stands taller, and love, when it is real, never dies. So I leave you with this: if you were in my place, could you forgive them? Or would you let justice carry the full weight? Tell me in the comments. I want to hear your thoughts. And please like this video, subscribe for more stories, and remember to drink water and take care of your health. Until next time, may peace rest easy in your homes. If these stories matter to you, subscribe for more family betrayal stories. True or inspired, so you'll never miss the next chapter. Thank you for watching.